Hello, Enterprise Incidents fans. We are jumping in at the beginning of this episode just because there's things going on in the world that we wanted to talk about. I'm Steve Morris.
And I'm Scott Mantz, and things have certainly changed in just the short couple weeks since we recorded this episode and when we went to post. And we felt like it was really necessary to address that. So, even though we recorded this episode just a couple weeks ago, it doesn't sound dated. And I'm sure you know the episode we're going to be talking about in the context, the relevant context of which it now fits in today's world.
So when we recorded this, it was at the end of February, and this is 2022 for anyone who's listening to it years later. And at that time, Russia had advanced troops to the border of Ukraine, but they hadn't invaded yet. And at this point, it's a couple of weeks later, Russia's invaded Ukraine. They are attacking Kyiv. There's a real war going on. And this definitely relates to the episode of Star Trek that we're talking about.
And the episode of Star Trek that we are talking about, of course, is A Private Little War, an episode that was filmed as a direct take on the conflict in Vietnam at the time, but an episode that expands far beyond just Vietnam before and since with regards to, well, we'll get into all that in the actual episode, but in terms of having to really just pour our hearts out to the people of Ukraine, and of course, watching this episode now just makes it even more relevant for reasons that are appropriate but also unfortunate.
And I had a thought, Scott, which was I've been thinking about it a lot, and I actually think that Star Trek, the original series, is almost like a perfect guide to some of these problems we have in international relations. And I was wondering if you give me a moment to lay it out with you.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Here's the thought, is that we have two superpowers, and those are the Klingons and the Federation, like the Soviet Union and the United States, and they shouldn't fight each other, because if they fight each other, millions of people are going to die. So the Organians step in and say, no, we're going to stop this.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that those two great powers don't have interests. Maybe they have interests in terms of resources, like we see in Friday's Child, where both of them want resources of the planet. Well, that's oil in the Middle East, that's bananas and fruit in South America, and we fight for those resources. Maybe they're strategic needs. There's a place that's really important, like Sherman's planet that we see in Trouble with Tribbles.
That's right.
That's like the Suez Canal. That's like the Soviet Union always trying to get to the sea. Maybe it's that a country has a sphere of influence they want to protect. Well, that's like the Gorn trying to protect their planet in Arena. Well, that is China and Taiwan. That is the reason Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And that is the justification that Putin has given for invading Ukraine. And all of these are things that we see in Star Trek.
That's the thing about Star Trek, is that here we are more than 55 years after the original series first premiered. And so many of these themes, like just for the tip of the iceberg, the ones that you just mentioned, are still relevant today. And that's why the show holds up. And that's really one of the reasons why we're even doing this podcast, and why it's really connecting with people who've been listening and who've been sharing it around. For that, we definitely thank you. But this is something that, in just a couple weeks, Steve, since we recorded our deep dive on A Private Little War, as the situation in Ukraine has escalated, I really thought to myself, boy, I wish we could go back and re-record this deep dive. But I think that's why your idea to do this introduction before we really get into it was really a great idea.
Well, thank you. And you know what it is that we see Star Trek wrestling with these issues back in the mid 60s, and you and I are wrestling with them today. And I think the reality is, and that's what makes Private Little War so powerful, there's no solution here. There's no like magical way that Captain Kirk can sweep in and solve all these problems. They're complicated, they're difficult, and they're often tragic.
And the other thing I thought about too, especially since we recorded the episode, because the things we talked about in the conversation are things that really stayed with me, and I really thought more about, and actually wish we could have gone back. Hey, let's record more. But the thing that really struck me was, in the case of A Private Little War, it was an escalation that was very easy to start because the Klingons stepped in and armed the villagers. But it's a situation that has no easy resolution because of the situation that Captain Kirk feels he is forced into and the decision that he feels he has to make. Was that the right decision? That's up to you to decide. Was that the only decision? That's something we get into in the episode.
And as important as Star Trek is, and as much as we love Star Trek, it's not nearly as important as the people in Ukraine and what's going on in the real world and the brave people that are just trying to protect their lives, the lives of the people they love, and the country that they live in.
And it's really, really great for you to be here, to join us here on Enterprise Incidents as we get into our deep dive of A Private Little War. So without further ado, let's get to it.
And if the Klingons give their side even more, then we arm our side with exactly that much more. A balance of power. The trickiest, most difficult, dirtiest game of them all, but the only one that preserves both sides.
Bridge to all decks, brace yourself, and I mean brace yourself, for what's bound to be a very provocative episode of Enterprise Incidents with Scott and Steve. I'm Scott Mantz.
And I'm Steve Morris, and usually at this point I make some kind of dumb joke regarding the episode, and I don't really have a dumb joke, and B, I just said to Scott off mic, I'm still struggling to figure out exactly how I feel about A Private Little War.
I don't blame you. I understand. Because for the first time since we've been doing Enterprise Incidents, usually I'll rewatch the episode once to prepare for our deep dive. But over the last 5 days, I have rewatched A Private Little War 3 times. Wow. Not because I don't know what to say about it. I certainly know what I want to say about it. Curious to know how that will change after our conversation. But what I remember about our discussion, off camera about A Private Little War, Steve, is that when we first decided to move forward with doing Enterprise Incidents in the first place, I vividly remember you saying to me, imagine the kind of conversation we're going to have on Enterprise Incidents when we get to an episode like A Private Little War. And now, Steve, here we are.
Yes. And I still don't know the answer to what kind of conversation we have. And I think it's because, I'll answer the question that you normally ask about how did I always feel about this episode. To me, this is a solidly in the middle episode. It's not terrible. It's not great. I've always found it engaging, and I've always found it really troubling. And it's definitely one where the more I think about it, the more conflicted I get about this episode.
I completely understand. There are certain episodes we talked about where, like when I was a kid growing up, maybe I thought they were okay, or I thought they were fine, entertaining enough. But as I've grown up and as I've gotten older and hopefully wiser, my opinion on these episodes changed. And of course, another way to bring up Metamorphosis, that's one that I've come to appreciate more to the extent that it's my favorite episode of all time. But in the case of A Private Little War, yeah, growing up, I thought it was an entertaining episode, a lot of action, a lot going on, location shooting, production design, wardrobe, a monster and a
suit.
In a suit, yeah. But it is really an episode that in more recent years, and I say recent meaning like 10 years, this is an episode where I go, wait a minute, do I really agree with our hero, Captain James T. Kirk, for his actions in this episode? And I still don't know the answer to that because I don't know what his options were, what his alternative was. I'm sure we're going to get into that. But, this is an episode that, just like Bread and Circuses, which I felt like has gotten more relevant in more recent years because of something like reality TV, an episode like Miri, which has gotten extremely relevant because of a global pandemic. Here's an episode that has gotten relevant, I would say even, 20 years ago because of Afghanistan. And it is still the same old problem for which there is no easy resolution. And regardless of whether you agree with the resolution, there is no easy resolution.
Well, and I would say, of course, it did continue to be relevant for a 20-year war in Afghanistan. And right at this moment, as we're recording it, the Russian army is on the border of Ukraine, and the United States is in the position of having to decide what to do. Mm-hmm. What do we do when there is someone who is about to go into a country and do we interfere? I mean, this is, and we're never going to not have to deal with these problems as long as we're a world superpower, which at least for a long time, I think we're going to be. And this is the one thing I'll say before we get into it is obviously these are complicated political issues. And I will just say that anybody who thinks that what happens in a private little war and really what happens in our world is a simple problem is wrong.
Absolutely.
Like these are not simple. There is no simple solution to any of this.
No, there's not.
And there is no solution in which nobody gets hurt. There's no solution in that's clean. It's all complicated. It's all difficult. And whatever decisions are made, there will be downsides to them.
And there's definitely going to be a lot to talk about as we go through this episode. And just before we get into it, Steve, because we've been doing these deep dives, for the first time since ever watching A Private Little War, it made me think of two prior episodes. One of them, well, can you guess which episodes I'm thinking of?
There are a bunch, actually. I mean, I think, because I think of Errand of Mercy.
Okay.
I think of Taste of Armageddon.
Okay.
I think of The Apple.
Okay.
And there are other ones. I mean, but those ones to start.
The Apple was definitely one I was definitely in the forefront of my mind, with the Garden of Eden being referenced a couple times. Another one, more for the aesthetic of it, the production value, the location, is Friday's Child.
Sure.
And then, of course, Errand of Mercy, because you're referencing the treaty,
right?
Although it's never actually said the Organian Peace Treaty. But Private Little War was very heavily rewritten by Gene Roddenberry himself, to the point where he got the teleplay by credit over Don Ingalls. Don Ingalls wrote the story, and he was credited for the story not under Don Ingalls, but under Judd Crucis. So he was heavily rewritten by Gene Kuhn, but definitely by Gene Roddenberry, to the point where he did not like what Gene Roddenberry did with his original story, that he used a pseudonym. And Don Ingalls, this is the second of two unpleasant experiences for him, because he also wrote The Alternative Factor. So, yeah, Star Trek just was not good to Don Ingalls. But the episode was directed by Mark Daniels. Mark Daniels, who, with all the episodes of Star Trek he had already done by this point, this was his first episode that he did on location. So I thought he did a great job with that part of it.
Sure.
The episode was filmed between September 29th and October 6th, 1967, in 6 days. So it was on schedule. It was the 46th episode to film. It was the 48th episode to air, which it did on February 2nd, 1968. And yet, with all of the location shooting and the hair, the makeup, the wardrobe, this episode came in under budget.
Wow.
The budget for A Private Little War, the cost of it, rather, was $179,427, under the per episode budget around this time, which was around $180,000 to $182,500. So it came in about $3,000 under budget. They did save a little bit of money on the score, because it was all tracked, except for that very last bit at the end. When he says, "We're very tired, Mr. Spock, beam us up home."
Yeah.
That was a new bit of music. Not recorded for this episode, but used only at the end of this episode because it was so downbeat. But as I mentioned...
Can I say something real quick just about the budget? There's a lot of scale to this. We're on location. We got a lot of costumes and wardrobe and hair and makeup and all that stuff, as you said. The only way to come in under budget under those circumstances is planning and efficiency and really, really knowing what you're doing.
Well,
that's how you save money.
The fact that they did all this in 6 days.
Yeah.
Mark Daniels was very, very prepared for this episode.
Be prepared, yeah.
For sure. And it obviously was in really great hands. But when Don Ingalls wrote his story outline on April 30th, 1967, the title was Tyree's Woman. When he went to a second revised story outline on June 10th, that's when he changed it to A Private Little War. He wrote 2 draft teleplays, the second of which came in on August 30th. Then Gene Kuhn, before he left the series in early September, this is probably one of the last teleplays that Gene Kuhn worked on, because he left in early September. He did a script polish, and then Gene Roddenberry did his rewrite on September 20th. Then he did 2 polishes, the second of which came in on September 25th. And, you know, what I noticed, okay, so for the first half of the second season, Roddenberry wasn't really there. He was away, either on vacation or prepping a TV movie version of Robin Hood, which never happened. So it was during that time, we discussed this during Mud's Women and Trouble with Tribbles. You know, Gene Coon took the series in a more lighthearted direction, shall we say. Gene Roddenberry came back. He didn't like that. And as David Gerald pointed out during our discussion on Trouble with Tribbles, that rift is the reason why Gene Coon left the series. So what I think happened was Gene Roddenberry, with like Bread Circuses and definitely with A Private Little War, wanted to exert his authority as executive producer.
Right.
And he really took the show back. And that is why he certainly had a lot to say. He was very preachy in this episode, for better or worse. But he is the sole teleplay credit, which I think is interesting.
I think it's so too bad that and who knows, you know, people can get very possessive. They can get very intense about their opinion and very stubborn. And I wish when Gene Roddenberry came back, he could have said, listen, I hate this iMud thing and it's way too comedic.
Yeah.
But you made some great episodes on Mirror Mirror and Doomsday Machine, all these ones that are not overly comedic at all. And just instead of having a big blow up, have a course correction.
Yeah.
Say, let's stay more in this camp over here. And this was too far.
Right.
You know, and then everybody can be happy and Gene Coon can stay on the show.
Such a shame. You know, it's such a what. There are so many what ifs with Star Trek. What if Gene Coon stayed on? What if Star Trek got a much better time slot in its third season in order for Roddenberry to stay on and to take back his role as the showrunner like he had in the first half of the first season? So many what ifs. And it's a tragedy.
Well, and the weird thing about it is, if those amazing things had happened, we probably wouldn't have 97 Star Trek shows today, because it's the show going off. If it had a great 6-year run, people go, wow, that was a great show. It's because it went off the air that you had the this groundswell of attention that made it become part of our cultural landscape.
Well, that's what I like to call, and I've mentioned this quite a few times, but people really picked up on how I've referred to that period in the early 70s where people like you and me discovered the show in syndication. It was the syndication generation that gave Star Trek its new life, leading to the movies and all these, like you said, 97 other Star Trek shows, which some of them are good. And some of them are not. But anyway, back to A Private Little War. So my question for you, Steve, and I couldn't wait to ask you this question, is with an episode that had so much to say, whether you like it or not, was there a lot going on in the world during the production of this episode?
The answer is yes. And the biggest things, there are 2 things happening right at this moment. The first is on September 29th, Lyndon Johnson made a speech in Texas at which he said, I am convinced that seeing this struggle through now in Vietnam, we are reducing the chances of a larger war, perhaps a nuclear war. I mean, that's as on point of A Private Little War.
Absolutely,
as
it
you
is.
could imagine.
Yeah, he's where Kirk is at the end of the episode, basically.
Even though he's heard already that the evidence that the war is unwinnable. All those things that has come out later in the Pentagon Papers, he already knows about. On October 1st, Color TV has now made it to France. So we've had it in Canada, in England, in Germany, and France. It's slowly making its way around the world. On the 2nd, Thurgood Marshall was sworn in as the first African-American justice of the Supreme Court. He served 24 years until 1991.
Wow.
On October 3rd, the X-15 rocket plane completed the fastest ever flight of an aircraft, reaching Mach 6.724, 5,200 something miles per hour.
Wow.
And,
fast.
And depending on how you do your statistics, this is the fastest plane ever in the world.
Interesting.
Wow. There's another one that's it's really a rocket that they were testing to go into space that had a low, not into space flight that's much faster than this. But this is the fastest real plane. North Vietnam, on the same day, rejected LBJ's peace proposal, his latest one. And then the U.S. dropped bombs closer to communist China in North Vietnam than they ever had before. So we're at this moment that he makes a peace offer while simultaneously saying we're going to get rid, this is going to stop a larger war, and then we're bombing even closer to communist China.
We haven't even reached the peak in terms of its production, Steve. We have not yet reached the peak of the Vietnam conflict. But by the time this aired in February, wasn't that around the time of the Tet Offensive?
It's right after the Tet Offensive. That's one of the things I was going to say.
Man.
Because the Tet Offensive is over basically right near Christmas, I think, of that year. And here's, how when you watch the news that they then have their little comedy one?
Yeah.
Well, here's ours for this week is on October 4th, there was a literal bull in a china shop in Chester, Pennsylvania. In Chester, Pennsylvania, a large bull escaped from a slaughterhouse and ran amok in downtown, went through two, not just one, but two jewelry stores, breaking a lot of glass and causing a lot of damage.
A bull in a china shop.
A literal bull in a china shop. And that is what was going on when this film came out.
Wow, amazing.
Shall we get into it?
Let's get into A Private Little War.
Hey, Starfleet was right.
These roots and soil cultures can be a medical treasure house. Any problems there?
No sign of the inhabitants so far. Kirk out.
And Kirk is with Spock, and they spot a big footprint in the ground.
The footprint that you see is called the footprint of a Mugatu. But the footprint that we actually see, my friend, is stock from the rabbit in Shirley.
It's the same. It's stock footage.
It's stock footage.
I didn't realize that. That's awesome.
But so these scenes that we're seeing on location actually started filming on day 2 of the production. It was the first of 3 days on location at Bell Ranch, which is an area separating the San Fernando Valley from Simi Valley. And the planet that they are on, Steve, it's never mentioned in the actual episode, but it is in the script.
Okay.
And remember how I said the planet from Bread and Circuses, not mentioned. Fans kind of gave it a name, or fan fiction, Magna Roma. So, but this was actually written in the script for A Private Little War. It was called Norral. What does that sound like?
Say it again.
Norral.
Sounds like moral.
Sounds like neutral.
Oh, neutral. Oh.
Yeah, all that's missing is the T.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so that's a little bit of for an episode that is not subtle. The planet name is also not subtle.
Aside from that, you say it's a Garden of Eden.
And here's some, we've kind of connected all of these episodes with similar themes. I think we've come up with ways that that's really interesting because we're exploring the same ideas from multiple angles. There's also a certain point where it's like, come on, guys, let's have a few. We're spending a lot of time in Garden of, all the way back to The Cage. We're dealing with ideas of Gardens of Eden, and maybe we've been here a lot.
It's interesting to hear you, a filmmaker, say that, because the filmmakers who made this episode felt the exact same way. Yes, for sure. Especially Dorothy Fontana. She said, "Didn't we already do this? With the apple?" And certainly, there are a lot of similarities, like I mentioned, to Friday's Child. But it's okay. I still think it works, and in this case, there is a history for Kirk, isn't there, in this episode?
Aside from that, you say it's a Garden of Eden.
Or so it seems with the brash young Lieutenant Kirk in command of his first planet survey.
That was 13 years ago. So my guess is because it was around that time that Kirk had his experience with the cloud vampire in Obsession. He mentions last time I caught an order like that was 11 years ago, and so I'm guessing that Kirk was on the Farragut during this time, even though he didn't mention the ship.
Is this before or after he was teaching at the academy?
That's my question. I'm assuming it was after, but 13 years ago was a very long time, and Kirk is 34 years old. So I'm guessing that this is before Kirk taught at the academy.
So I don't think the timeline quite makes sense because of Gary Mitchell's age.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because but I think but in terms of character, it would make sense to me that the very serious Lieutenant Kirk is after what happened with the cloud and Obsession.
I completely
That would
agree.
make sense to me.
Yeah. I think that's, in terms of the timeline, that makes perfect sense to me too.
And what we hear is that this is an incredibly peaceful society, and even though they have things like bows and arrows, there's no fighting amongst themselves. It's peaceful, it's tranquil, and then we hear someone yelling.
Oh, take cover here.
Just on cue, because Kirk is saying it. They're so peaceful, and then you hear, over here, and Then
we
Kirk
look.
and Spock look on in the distance.
And there's some guys with guns.
Some guys with flintlocks.
Yep.
There's no way they should have
Possible.
flintlocks because Spock says, weren't you just talking about bows and arrows? Mm-hmm. So something is definitely wrong, and it's going to get wronger.
Well, and not only that, we see these people are dressed, these are the villagers, and they're dressed in, kind of old-fashioned, like medieval sort of outfits. And then we see in the distance, there are some hill people, which are dressed in more primitive outfits. And by the way, now whenever I hear the word hill people, I hear... from Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
I can't not hear that. And Kirk's first instinct is to draw
take out his phaser. He draws his phaser. Spock reminds him about the Prime Directive.
Yep.
So soon after Bread and Circuses, where they were so driven to abide by the Prime Directive. So he looks for something to distract the villagers from shooting the hill people because his friend Tyree, who he lived with, is among those hill people who were walking and into an ambush.
Yep.
So he takes a stone and he throws it, and as the stone hits the ground, the villager is distracted, fires his gun, misses his target, and Tyree screams out, "Villagers!" And then all hell breaks loose. Kirk and Spock are running away, and the villagers are running after Kirk and Spock.
One of the villagers aims, open fire, and Spock goes down in a big fall. And I'm wondering if this is the same stunt guy.
Oh, yeah. It doesn't look like J. Jones.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a hell of a fall. Mm-hmm. So in earlier versions of this story, it was actually Kirk who got shot.
Oh.
Now, the reason why it was changed is because Dorothy Fontana was the one who pointed out that there's no way that Nona is going to be able to cure Kirk from a gunshot wound.
And McCoy can't.
Right. And it was actually Bob Justman who said, let's have someone else get shot because Kirk is going to get bit by the creature. And that's where we need Nona to cure him and basically influence him for the rest of the episode.
What I think so great about it is, and I don't know if this was the purpose or the thought process behind it, is what it sets up is that Kirk is not with Spock. He's with McCoy.
Right.
And I think, because most of these adventures, if we're going to have an adventure down on the planet, it's usually Kirk and Spock, if it's going to be just two of them. And I think the fact that it is McCoy throughout this episode is way better.
I agree. And the dynamic between Kirk and McCoy
Very different.
Is very different from the dynamic with Kirk and Spock. So after Spock, like you pointed out, he goes down. And here come the villagers. Mm-hmm. And Kirk, again, takes out his phaser.
No, Captain. I can travel.
This part of the teaser actually reminded me of that moment in Bread and Circuses where the landing party beamed up in the absolute nick of time.
Now, Scotty, have medics stand by.
They're beaming up, and just as the materialization is complete, the villagers get there, and they're like, where'd they go? Now, here's what's interesting. I never noticed this before. But as Kirk and Spock and McCoy are beaming up to the Enterprise, in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, McCoy's equipment that it was taking the soil samples, it's right there in the bottom right-hand part of the screen.
Oh.
But when the three of them beam up, the transporter effect is over Shatner, Nimoy, and DeForest Kelley, but not on the equipment, and the equipment just disappears. So it's a little bit of a snafu there with this visual effects, but I could see why they would have missed it. But it's a great teaser. A lot happens in 3 minutes and 30 seconds.
Absolutely. And we start Act 1. We're in the transporter room. Spock is hurt, and there is a new doctor there.
Oh, yes. Dr. Mbenga, played by Booker Bradshaw. And this is the first of two appearances of Dr. Mbenga in the original series, because we were going to see him again, apparently, in the brand new Star Trek Strange New Worlds series. But Booker Bradshaw played Mbenga again in That Which Survives from season 3. So Booker Bradshaw was actually, in addition to being an actor on TV shows like Tarzan, The FBI, and The Mod Squad, Booker Bradshaw was also a Writers Guild Award nominee for an episode of The Rockford Files. Oh. He also wrote episodes for Columbo, The Jeffersons, Good Times, Different Strokes, and give me a break. And so when we come back into Act 1 and we see that A Private Little War, teleplay by Gene Roddenberry, story by Judd Crucis.
Mm-hmm.
So Judd Crucis, like I mentioned, is a pseudonym for Don Ingalls. And where did Judd Crucis come from? It actually comes from Judicious Crucis, where two kings send out two paladins to battle each other rather than two armies, and whoever won the fight won the war. That's where that pseudonym comes from.
So kind of a private little war.
Exactly. A private little war, only in this war was won by Gene Roddenberry.
That's a good point. By the way, I love the casting of Dr. Mbenga.
He's great.
I mean, and the thing is again, it's doing this thing of, without putting a lot of spotlight on it, of going, here is an extremely educated, important, respected figure, then we're giving this to an African-American. And it's interesting too, Mbenga is an African name. So it's saying things about what's gone on Earth, you know, as well, in terms of how all these civilizations have worked a lot of stuff out in a couple of centuries.
See, now, what I love about the original series, when we had Percy Rodriguez play Commodore Stone in Court Martial, here in the 60s, during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, you have a black actor playing a prominent role. It doesn't matter that he's black or white. It's just he's a doctor, you know, and he's there because he's a doctor. And I just love that for the diversity and the representation that we saw in the original series. It just was. It was there. It didn't have to draw attention to itself. It didn't have to beat you over the head with it. I thought Booker Bradshaw was a great addition to this episode, and certainly that which survives. It's a shame we didn't see him more often. I really, really like this guy.
Lucky his heart's where his liver should be, or he'd be dead now.
A little bit of anatomy too.
Yeah, Vulcan anatomy.
And right at this moment, we hear a red alert because there is a Klingon vessel coming in. And this is this thing that Star Trek does well, of like, we have one emergency and we're going to layer a second emergency on top of it.
And this is really great. Like when they beam aboard the Enterprise and they're in the transporter room, like right there, McCoy is like basically checking Spock out and trying to sort of
Being
almost
a good
operate.
doctor.
Yeah. There you go. This is what you've been waiting for.
Yep.
This is the comeuppance.
Well, we just came from Journey to Babel. He was a really good doctor in Journey
There
to
you
Babel.
go. Right.
Sometimes he is, sometimes he isn't.
But so Kirk is making his way to the bridge with Scotty, and he turns around and he looks back at McCoy and he says,
Bones, I don't know yet, Jim.
And the performances are great, I think, in that moment. We're on the bridge, and what we find out from Chekhov is that basically the Klingons haven't noticed them because we're on the other side of the planet from them, and hopefully we can stay not noticed. And they can't give a message to Starfleet because that would give themselves away. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Kirk to sick bay.
McCoy here. I'll call you as soon as I know anything. Sick bay out.
And again, Shatner's performance is great.
He's great. He's got a lot on his mind.
Yep.
He's got his friend and his first officer, his science officer, has been shot. He doesn't know if he's going to live. This peaceful planet that he had such fond memories of has been disrupted, and now the Klingons are there. Here's my question for you.
Yes.
Why are the Klingons there?
I assume that it's like, well, we've heard that there's good resources here for McCoy that can be used for medical stuff. We assume there are other resources like there were in Friday's Child. And maybe in terms of its position, this is a good location, just like Organia or any of those places were. That's my assumption.
Sherman's Planet.
Or Sherman's Planet, yeah.
Okay, now those are great assumptions, but I feel like this is one of the flaws of this teleplay is that we don't know exactly why they're there.
Right.
Like I never thought about, well, McCoy's putting out the chemical compounds of the organics. Maybe that's why they're there. I mean, maybe. I mean, it doesn't seem like a very Klingon thing to be into. In terms of the strategic position of the planet, that's certainly a motive. Maybe there were dilithium crystals there. That would have been a hell of a motive. But we don't know. We really don't know why they are there. Why are they so interested in this planet? Like, what's in it for them? What's the end game here for the Klingon involvement and for the Klingons to go a step further than they did in Friday's Child? In Friday's Child, they were both after.
It was like mining rights or something.
It was mining rights for life-saving materials.
Right.
Okay. But neither the Federation nor the Klingons offered to arm the Capellans.
Right.
The Capellans didn't need it. the Capellans were doing quite fine with the Clea, which was just as deadly as phaser. In this case, this is a very, very primitive society, almost Stone Age, that has now been advanced by, the horror says, 12 centuries.
So I think this is problematic in a whole bunch of story reasons. And I think part of the reason they don't go into this anymore is it would expose why this actually ruins the show, I think. Because why are we hiding from the Klingons? Like, why are we trying to not let them see us? We have a peace treaty with them. We literally, at Space Station, whatever it was for the Trouble with Tribbles, K7, we're having conversations with them. See, I won't remember any of those things. We're having conversations with them. If you have a peace treaty, you could just go, hey, Klingons, what are you guys doing here?
Right. That's right.
And if you have a peace treaty that says you can't arm this other planet, if they're violating the peace treaty, well, then you go and you deal with that. You're breaking your agreement according to our peace treaty. We're going to go back to those balls of light on Organia and say, hey, these guys are cheating. Like, there is no reason that you have to do what they're doing. And it also goes to like, well, why are the Klingons arming this group of people?
That's my problem.
You know, it's like
why are they doing this?
And what I think their this solution is, we're just going to avoid talking about that. We don't want any, and this is, of course, one of the many signs of bad writing. If there's a major flaw in your story and you go, let's just avoid it instead of let's solve it. And I think it's because they wanted to create this situation where they could create this problem.
Exactly.
And so they chose to ignore all this other stuff.
That the stakes needed to be clear on why, A, the Klingons are there, and B, why they're taking the extra step to arm the villagers and advance their technology to kill the hill people. But again, like, why don't they just, the Klingons could come in and just with one Klingon vessel wipe out the entire population of the planet and just take it over.
And if you had said, which they kind of hinted at in Errand of Mercy, it's like, well, the Klingons' methodology is to and in Friday's Child, is to create allies with a particular group and help them gain power, and then they will rule as a Klingon governor of part of the Klingon Empire. If we were talking about that, that would make this thing make sense. But again, then we get to the peace treaty, and why are we not confronting them directly?
Exactly.
But so that's a bad thing about the writing. But I will say a good thing about the writing is exposition is always what's hard in writing. And if you want to have it, you could have someone just do a monologue about flintlocks and development in 12 centuries. But instead, you have people arguing about it. People are bringing up different points, and that's always better for exposition. It's always better when there's conflict, even if it's a minor one. And I love that Chekhov and Scotty and Uhura are all they all know stuff.
Chiming in.
And they're all chiming in until Kirk gets frustrated.
I did not invite a debate.
And everybody goes back to their stations, and Kirk apologizes.
I'm sorry.
Even though I have problems with the episode, leaders that apologize, that is such a key thing. Not only does he apologize, but he expresses vulnerability.
I'm worried about Spock. I'm concerned about what's happened to something I once knew down there.
This is a leader that is able to admit mistakes and show vulnerability. And that is part of what makes... And nobody goes like, oh, Kirk's weak because he admitted that he made a mistake or that he's worried.
And it's not the first time he has apologized.
We've no replacements for the damaged organs, sir. If he's going to live, his Vulcan physiology will have to do it for him.
So my question is, we just had Journey to Babel.
Yes.
Where you had this very, very big deal that McCoy was not familiar with Vulcan physiology to oversee this transfusion between Spock and Sarek. And then you hear in this episode that Spock is in great hands because Dr. Mbenga interned in a Vulcan ward. So where was Mbenga when they needed him?
Well, maybe that's why he's here. Because maybe McCoy and Kirk went, man, we could really use an expert on Vulcan physiology.
Bingo. That's it.
No, Mbinga, not bingo.
Mbinga.
Mbingo. This is also setting up. I also think it's because they just wanted to set up the thing that they're setting up for the B story. And this is definitely a clearly separated A stories and B stories. And when Kirk hears that Spock couldn't be in better hands, he says, good, then you and I are transporting down.
There are Klingons here. If their mission is a legitimate research interest in the planet's organic potential, then you're the one man who can tell me.
And if that's not it?
Then I need help. Advice I can trust as much as Spock's.
I think that's great.
I think that's great.
I think it's really good.
If the Klingons are breaking the treaty, it could be interstellar war.
Well, and the thing is, the Klingons are breaking the treaty.
For sure they are.
But his solution to this problem is really, well, we're going to get into what that
we'll get
solution
into
is.
that. But the Klingons are breaking the treaty.
Yep.
So where are the Organians?
Yeah.
Like, did they just sort of make their point, show their power in Errand of Mercy, and we're not seeing them again? They're done. Well, peace out.
Yes, that is exactly what. Did they ever appear again in Star Trek ever?
Not in this form.
Yeah. And the other thing we hear is we're planning to beam down. Is that in order to stay hidden from the Klingons, we might have to leave orbit, which is again a thing that we've heard in various other episodes.
Sure. Yeah, it happened in Arena.
In Arena, yeah. Mm-hmm. So we beam down. We're now in some native outfits.
Want to think about it again, Jim? Starfleet's orders about this planet state no interference with...
No interference with normal social development. I'm not only aware of it, it was my survey 13 years ago that recommended it.
It's amazing, like when we were going through season 1, like towards the end, they started to get into the Prime Directive.
Right.
But season 2, you were really, really into the Prime Directive. Like it has been explored and it has been broken.
Right.
I mean, you have the way it was. You have an extreme situation like in Bread and Circuses, where they really did everything they could to preserve the Prime Directive, and then you have a situation in the Apple where they broke it.
Right.
I mean, they justified breaking it, but they still broke it.
Well, and this is the thing where the threat to the Enterprise is a big deal because, and I wish that in the Prime Directive they actually had a rule that said, "Hey, listen, if you're being attacked, you can use self-defense
defend yourself."
But that doesn't seem to be a rule that we've actually established.
Right.
And the other thing we hear is that McCoy read his report, which I think is cool, and says,
Inhabitants superior in many ways to humans. Left alone, they undoubtedly someday will develop a remarkably advanced and peaceful culture.
Indeed. And I intend to see that they have that chance.
Up to this point, Kirk has not sort of gone there with thinking about, we have to arm the Hill people. He hasn't gone there yet. What he's still thinking is the end of Errand of Mercy. When he says no one wants war. And he was humbled. And he said at the very end of the episode, you think you're the most powerful force in the universe. It's humbling to think that you're wrong. But they avoided a war because the Organians raided the game.
Yep.
So at this point in this episode, he's still going by that. He's still thinking, I want these people to have a peaceful existence. I want these people to have what they had when I was here 13 years ago. And he's in for a very rude awakening. And in a lot of ways, one of them about to happen at this moment.
Right. Because he's walking forward, and I think it's actually still shocking. That scream comes out of nowhere. And yes, it's a guy in a big fuzzy suit, but it's a pretty good big fuzzy suit.
That big fuzzy suit is good enough to the point where I still get scared by the Mugatu.
Yep.
Like, I think it is a great suit. I mean, yeah, it looks like a guy in a fuzzy suit, just like the Gorn looked like a guy in a rubber suit. But I still think it's very effective. I think the scream that the Mugatu lets out it's scary. And the Mugatu is definitely a predator, and they're all over the place on this planet. So it's not going to be a surprise, Steve, to hear that the Mugatu was created and performed by Janis Prohaska, who created and performed not only the Horta for The Devil in the Dark, but also Yarnik in The Savage Curtain from season 3.
By the way, those have very clear rankings in my mind. The Mugatu's the coolest. The Horta is weird, and the season 3 guys.
I love the Mugatu. Again, the Mugatu just looks great. That big horn on it.
Yeah, it's cool.
The white fur. Now,
I should say, by the way, we have a listener whose Twitter handle, who has written to us many times, I believe is the Undiscovered Mugatu.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that when we were doing this episode. So Undiscovered Mugatu, this episode is for you. And Undiscovered Mugatu will certainly know that in the script, the creature was not called the Mugatu. It was called the Gumatu with a G. The letters were switched. And it says, if you look at the end credits, it says Gumatu in the end credits, but DeForest Kelly had trouble saying Gumatu. He kept saying Mugatu. So for the sake of filming the episode, it was Mugatu.
I think I like Mugatu better.
Yeah, Mugatu.
It's hard because you've heard it a million times and the other one's foreign. So,
Right, exactly.
So it's not familiar. And Kirk goes down, and when that thing bites Kirk, it's scary.
Yeah.
And McCoy has his phaser out, but can't shoot it because it's on top of Kirk, gets him off with like a rock, and then kills the Mugatu with the phaser. And Kirk is already in trouble.
First of all, McCoy, DeForest Kelley, is terrific in this episode.
Yeah, I agree.
This is a great episode for DeForest Kelley. And I feel like DeForest Kelley has had so many really good moments and really good episodes, but I still think that his performance, his contributions are not fully appreciated. He was superb in The Deadly Years. He was terrific in Bread and Circuses. And now he's even more prominent in this episode because Spock isn't down there with them. Like the way he gets the Mugatu off of Kirk by throwing the rock, it's like, ha, ha, and he throws the rock, and then the Mugatu like jumps off of him and turns towards McCoy, and McCoy fires his phaser, and the Mugatu disappears.
Well, and this is the thing, is we get to see a really strong McCoy in this episode because, as you say, Spock's not here. And Kirk is obviously really sick. McCoy calls up to the Enterprise. Enterprise is left.
And Kirk is clearly, he's in shock.
Yep.
And he is being affected by the poison. And like, I tell you, watching Shatner thrive in pain, writhe in pain like that, I believe that he was really in pain.
It's funny. It's come up on the Cinephiles of who is the best acting in pain actor. And the one that, it's just because it came up multiple times, Mel Gibson was the clear winner. But there was some other ones now, I can't remember who, but Shatner's really good.
Yeah. What did you use to make up Mel Gibson's example?
In Braveheart.
Braveheart? Because he looked like he was in a lot of pain in Lethal Weapon too.
Well, that's other ones we were talking about. It came up multiple times that he was really good in pain.
But Shatner
does great.
Tyree, some of his men. You're...
Fortunately, McCoy at that moment looks up, and there are 3 hill people standing over him, and he yells to them.
A Mugatu attacked him. He's James Kirk. He's a friend of Tyree's. Blasted, do something. He's dying.
Great end to Act 1.
Yep. And Act 2, we're carrying Kirk almost Christ-like into the village.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah, his arms are out.
Medical log, stardate 4211.8. Kirk is right about the people here. Despite their fear and our strangeness, they are compassionate and gentle.
And we hear that Tyree has become their leader and that he's going to come back soon with his wife.
You and your Garden of Eden.
What's interesting is you have Kirk. He is incapacitated on the planet. What's happening on the Enterprise? Spock is incapacitated. So this is the only time, I think, in not just the original series, but the movies, where Kirk and Spock are both incapacitated at the same time, just not in the same place.
Right. Well, it's a good point because this is also why McCoy kind of gets to shine a bit because Kirk's not there and Spock's not there. We see some villagers walk by with their flintlocks, and then out from behind the trees comes Tyree and his wife, Nona.
Tyree is played by Michael Whitney. Michael Whitney, I did not know this, but you know Twiggy?
Yeah.
Okay, so Michael Whitney was married to Twiggy.
Oh.
Yeah, it was his second wife until Michael Whitney died in November of 1983 of a heart attack. He was only 52 years old, the guy who plays Tyree, which was really shocking. But on TV, Michael Whitney was in shows like Death Valley Days, The FBI, Bonanza, and Charlie's Angels. As for Nona, wow, Nancy Kovac, she's terrific in this episode.
I agree.
But the what happens to her is really disturbing, and we'll get into all that. But Nancy Kovac is actually an Emmy nominee for her performance in the Mannix episode, "The Girl Who Came In with the Tide." She was also in TV shows like Batman, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Perry Mason, and Bewitched. And on film, on the big screen, she was in Jason and the Argonauts.
Oh.
And if the movie The Outlaws is coming, doesn't sound familiar, it's notable because it is the last movie to be made by the Three Stooges.
Oh, wow. And we talked about this before. We talked about this with Uhura in Mirror Mirror. This is a sexy outfit. And she
very
looks
sexy.
She looks amazing, and certainly, 11-year-old Steve was very, very aware of this particular Star Trek character.
Well, 53-year-old Scott is also very taken with this character. Yes, for no question that Bill Tice, the wardrobe designer for Star Trek, really knew how to dress the women. And Nancy Kovac. When I think of the criticism that Star Trek, the original series, gets today for the way that women were misrepresented, this is an episode that I absolutely think of. But at the same time, I think that Nona is a strong character. She is Lady Macbeth.
That's what I was going to say. Why do you think you would say she is misrepresented in this episode?
Well, because of the way that her fate. I'll save it for the last act of the episode. For the way that the hill people, or rather the villagers, see her as an object and basically gang rape her.
Well, they attempt to. They actually do that.
But it was always a hard scene to watch, and it's even harder to watch as a grown up in this day and age. It's just what happens to her character is really upsetting.
Well, we'll get to it, but it's supposed to be upsetting. That's why I don't see it as a misrepresentation. It's not that,
right.
What's weird about this episode in general is there are a lot of things where I go, this is well done. I don't know how I feel about it. And one of them is she is a really interesting character.
For sure.
Because she is on some levels our antagonist. On some levels, she's really aligned with what Kirk wants her to do. At some levels, she is a really troubling person. And that's why the Lady Macbeth thing is spot on.
Yeah.
So I don't think she's a misrepresented character. I think she is a complicated, three-dimensional, really difficult character.
In a lot of ways, you could say that she's a more fully realized character than in Friday's Child. Eliane. Eliane, she didn't want the baby. And the way that Eliane was originally written by Dorothy Fontana, she was much more aggressive.
Right.
Like the way that Nona actually is in this episode. So Fontana wanted... she didn't write this screenplay, but Fontana wanted Eliane to basically be like the person that Nona is in this episode.
Nona knows what she wants and is aggressively going after what she wants. And what she wants right now is to get some fire sticks like the villagers have so that they can start killing villagers. And Tyree is going, no, because he's basically a pacifist.
In time, the villagers will return to their ways of friendship.
In time, they kill your people.
And then we hear,
I am a Kanutu woman. In all this land, how many are there? Men seek us because through us they become great leaders.
Let me ask you a question.
Yes.
Does Nona love Tyree?
No.
No, she doesn't. No, she's just using him for his position and because she's seduced by power.
Well, and this is what's really interesting about her character. Because she just said men seek us because they become great leaders. And he says,
I took you because you cast a spell upon me.
How does Tyree feel about Nona?
Well, okay. Clearly, he feels for her on at least a physical level.
When she drugs him.
When she uses that plant, she puts it in his arm, and it's like some kind of hallucinogenic. How does Tyree feel about Nona? That's a great question. I mean, when he came to his senses, he should have been like, hit the road.
Because one of the other questions we're going to have to get to is how real are Nona's powers over Kirk? Because him saying, I took you because you cast a spell on me is not him saying, I love you or I sought you out.
Well, also what the influence that Nona has on Kirk goes much deeper, if you will, because of how she saved his life. And how she saved his life, which we're going to get to, goes a lot further than just saving his life.
Well, this is what we have to examine, because right now she says,
and I have spells that help me keep you.
Which means, by the way, she's not saying you love me. She's saying I have a spell to keep you with me.
I have power over you.
And clearly this leaf, whatever it is powerful.
Remember this leaf?
And he smells it.
The night we camped by the water.
And he calls it
The night of madness.
So clearly, this is a powerful drug. It turns people on, makes them lose their inhibitions, focuses him on her. And what I think some stuff happened for the night of madness.
Oh, that's why
where
they call it the night of madness.
where they had sex, and I think he is both turned on and ashamed of what happened.
Probably, yes. Yeah, that makes sense. But at the same time, the part of him that's turned on is the reason why that he still has her.
No. It brought up evil beasts from my soul.
Like, I don't think he likes her. I think he can't free himself from her. I think he is addicted to her, obsessed with her.
Well, I think that there is still something there because when you get to the end of the episode, the way he screams out her name.
Oh, yeah.
I think ultimately he does love her.
Well, I think what we could say is these are not simple emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think the rational part of his brain would like to get rid of her. And there is an emotional, deep, deep thing there.
Absolutely.
Because she calls him, which is what's interesting, is so she wants him to fight, right?
Mm-hmm.
She wants him to gain power. She wants to get him fire sticks, all this stuff. He became a evil beast during the night of madness, and she calls him my huge, angry man. Mm-hmm. Is that I think all of this is designed to bring out a side of Tyree that will help her to gain power.
Absolutely. That's it right there.
And what happens right at this moment, just as we assume that we're going to kind of get it on, is some of Tyree's people show up and say,
"There are strangers in our camp. One has taken the Mugatu bite. He dies."
Strangers?
It is said the dying one is a friend of Tyree from long ago.
And Nona knows right away.
Yep.
That one. She
Yeah.
knows exactly who they're talking about.
and she goes off with them and says,
"Bring him when his head clears."
I mean, he's like, and this happens to Kirk later in the episode.
"Oh yeah,
like she's got this power over him that he can't just come right out of it.
By the way, not for nothing, these look like some good drugs. I mean, I'm
that's
just
true.
I'm just saying.
Well, it was 1967 when they filmed it. A lot going on with the drugs culture there.
Yep. And we're back in the cave. Kirk is shivering, and McCoy's got his phaser out. And just like Sulu way back in Enemy Within, using that phaser to heat up some rocks.
Yep. And as he's heating up the rocks, Nona walks into the cave. McCoy is oblivious to the new presence. And right there, she sees this stranger wielding this little box that has a beam emanating from it, the likes of which Nona has never seen. This is beyond her imagination. And she's seeing this beam heat up rocks. She is seeing a display of power that she cannot conceive, that for a moment she's scared.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think you're right.
I think she's scared.
And she goes back to Tyree and basically says, "You got to tell me everything about this guy or I'm going to let him die."
I gave him my promise of silence. He was made my brother.
And I'm your wife, his sister. I promise silence also.
Nona, she's very manipulative. Again, the Lady Macbeth thing is right on point. She knows exactly what she's doing. She is like the powerful one.
Oh, yeah.
Here.
Well, and this is why it's going to, again, the end, but like Lady Macbeth, we can watch a character do terrible things and be really against them and still feel really bad for them later on in the story.
For sure.
And again, I'm not comparing A Private Little War to Macbeth. This episode has real problems.
Yeah.
But it also has and it's funny, like Alternative Factor is pretty much bad. It's just bad. And this is like stressful and compelling and difficult and interesting and not bad.
But problematic. Yeah, I agree.
Back on the Enterprise, Spock's readings are very low in sickbay. We hear that Vulcan music, and we see that Nurse Chapel is there holding his hand.
And I just liked how for a character who gets even less screen time than like Chekhov or Sulu, that they're still continuing, like, of all the people to have a common continuing thread. Chapel, this goes back to the Naked Time.
Yeah.
And that here we are in the middle of season 2, and she's still showing love and affection for Spock.
And I love, too, that she drops his hand just as Mbenga enters.
I've seen this before in Vulcans. It's a way of concentrating all their strength, blood, and antibodies onto the injured organs. A form of self-induced hypnosis.
I love that this episode deepens the physiology of Vulcans. Like, I feel like every so often you get like the mind meld and you get the pitch, you know, and then you got the pon far and a mock time. Sure. And now you've got this self-healing thing going on. What I don't like, I'll tell you, the one thing that I don't like is the inner eyelid.
No, that's terrible.
That's terrible.
so two things about it. You know, we've often talked about the different kinds of nerds you and I are. Mm-hmm. I'm guessing you probably didn't do this.
What?
Which is when I, particularly as a kid, had a cut or was injured or bruised, I would sit there and try to concentrate on it and meditate and see if I could send healing things to that spot.
No, that was not me.
And by the way, there are places where people can do things like this. This is not a completely there are people that are able to stop the bleeding coming out of a certain part of their body. I mean, these are real.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I forget which sect it is, where they put like a needle through their cheek and will pull it out and there's no blood and they have no pain. And then they've done it where they've had a guy like under scientific observation do it and watch what his brain, like in an fMRI machine, and watch what his brain is doing, and that it's silencing certain parts of the brain to do this thing. There are a lot of things that, you know.
That's very interesting. Yeah. I got to look that up.
Do you mean he's conscious?
Well, in a sense. He knows we're here and what we're saying, but he can't afford to take his mind from the tissue he's fighting to heal. I suppose he even knows you were holding his hand.
Caught.
Totally caught her, and her reaction is embarrassed.
Yeah.
It's a nice moment of levity.
We're back in the cave. And Tyree enters with Nona, and she pulls out the Mako root.
The Mako root.
Mako root.
The Mako root. And the interesting thing that I always notice, I remember even as a kid, it was moving.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was like a little scary. Like
it's creepy.
It's creepy. Like this thing is moving. And this is where I actually give Don Ingalls and certainly Roddenberry, if he had more to do with this part, with this scene, is unlike any other scene in all of Star Trek. Because when she puts the root on Kirk's wound, and then Tyree, he cuts her hand.
Right.
And she shows the hand to the camera. So, you know, this is a network television in 1967. And you've got this like gaping wound on her hand that was self-inflicted. And now you have Tyree thumping the little drum. And she slaps her hand down on top of the Mako root. And Nona and Kirk let out this passionate gasp. This scene has always been very erotic.
Yeah, I think it definitely has that weird element to it.
And the fact that you have the
she's
music
writhing around and the drum is beating. And,
absolutely. Yeah. She's not just healing him. She is making love to him. And she is definitely seducing him and casting a spell on him. There's a lot going on. And certainly when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, I definitely thought this was a hot scene. But I still think that this is an extremely unique and erotic and passionate scene. Very well acted, very well directed. And also the music that they're playing is the music from, the Cage when he gets to Rattle 7. And it's very, very effective, the score, the way that it's used to support this scene. And she's saying things like, your soul and mine. This is not just about healing the wound. She knows who Kirk is now. She knows what he represents. She has seen the power that he represents because she saw McCoy using the phaser. So she knows that in order for her to succeed and to advance and to go to where the power is, she knows that Kirk is her ticket to ride.
And I think the thing we can add to this is that we've already seen her use one plant on Tyree that clearly works and she knows how to use. And during this, there is no evidence that everything she's doing isn't real because it works.
Absolutely,
The
it
wounds
does.
disappear both on Kirk's shoulder and on her hand. Kirk comes back to life. Like, clearly she does know some deep stuff. And so whether we, it's like, because there's one interpretation that everything works, but he can't refuse her anything, which we're going to get to, is not true. But another interpretation is everything she says is true. And so the drum continues, and we have the big final beat, and she collapses on Kirk, and Kirk opens his eyes.
Bones. Had the strangest dream.
He's definitely spent and out of it, but he is cured.
Mm-hmm.
And McCoy notices right away. He goes to look for where the wound was on Kirk's shoulder, and it's gone.
Yep.
And then he looks at her hand, and the big gaping wound from the cut on her hand is also completely healed.
I would like to learn more about this.
Our blood has passed through the Mako root together. Our souls have been together. He is mine now.
And the interesting thing is that Tyree is just going along with it. He knew what Nona was doing. He knows the power that Nona has. He knows that Nona was the only way that Kirk was going to get healed. Mm-hmm. But as far as like everything else that goes along with that, the power that she will now have over him, he doesn't realize how jealous this is going to make him until he sees it for his own eyes.
Well, this is a weird moment because he says, because McCoy asks, he is hers.
When a man and woman are joined in this manner, he can refuse her no wish. But it is only legend.
Well, it's a little more than a legend.
Well, and this is the thing. And Tyree, what's the last scene? He said, "You put a spell on me." Mm-hmm. So I think the way he delivers the line, I actually think is really good because it's sort of flat. It's not going, it's only a legend. I don't believe in it. And it's not going, I'm telling you this is for real. It's sort of in the middle.
Yep.
I don't know how I feel. I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know how I feel about what's going to happen.
Well, what I was thinking about while I was watching this scene, and certainly rewatching this episode as many times as I did over the last few days, is that this woman is exerting her influence over Kirk, and she can refuse. He can't refuse her.
Right.
It reminded me of what we're going to see in the third season episode, A Land of Troyes, when the Doorman, he touches the tears, and he is like completely like under her spell.
Well, the thing is, and I don't think this episode does this well at all, is that Kirk has more power to overcome stuff than other people can't overcome than anybody else.
And why is that?
Enemy Within, Naked Time, Tantalus Device, over and over and over again, Kirk has had to overcome stuff. And so practice. He's built up the really, really strong will over time. We don't see him do that in this episode. It's really not here.
Well, I think the reason for that is all those other episodes you're talking about, it was his love for the Enterprise.
Right.
And he's not on the Enterprise here.
Well, and it's sort of, in those episodes, it all comes to a moment where he must overcome it. Mm-hmm. And this, it's sort of, we don't know how much in her sway he is, and then she dies, and then it's over. So it's like it doesn't really ever come to him, which again is sort of, it goes into it, and this is one of the issues with the episode. It's like, well, what is this episode really about? Is it about him dealing with this woman, and is he under a spell? Is it about international, treaties and things like that, or interstellar treaties?
Well, there's a lot. That's one thing about A Private Little War is that there is a lot going on, and even though some of it is questionable, I think more of it works than doesn't.
Yes,
more of it to the extent that like you pointed out, the alternative factor.
Right.
That's a bad episode. No. That doesn't work.
I think moment to moment, there's all sorts of things that work.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's the whole that it's like, doesn't work. I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But that brings us to the end of Act 2. In Act 3, McCoy wakes up in the cave, looks around to find Kirk, and where is Jim Kirk?
Jim Kirk is sitting out of it over Nona.
Which means that this is for real.
Yes.
Something is going on.
It
ain't nothing.
Right. And when Kirk comes to, he doesn't even realize where he is.
Yep.
Like, he doesn't, remember how he even got to sit by Nona's side like that.
Well, he doesn't know who she is at this moment because he doesn't remember any of this. Mm-hmm. And what does Tyree do when he wakes up?
He jolts awake.
Yeah.
He is like jolted awake. Something startles him, but then when he sees Kirk, he relaxes and he smiles.
But I also think there's this dude on my wife's bed. I think that's part of why he jumps up.
Oh, yeah. I always wondered, like, why did he jump up that?
I think he saw Kirk, because this is why I go back to the sort of flat delivery of he's not going to be able to refuse or anything, is he didn't know what was going to happen. And now the first thing he sees is he's at his wife's bed. Yeah. And it also goes to, again, we could talk about sort of the emotional logical split. Is logically Tyree is a pacifist and his friendship with Jim Kirk is huge. Emotionally, Nona's got her hooks into him in a big way.
For sure.
But that's not rational.
I told him to take me to Tyree's camp. I knew you'd find a Kanutu to cure me. That Kanutu is the local witch people here. They've studied...
And that's when we see Nona.
I am a Kanutu, Captain.
And as soon as Kirk sees Nona, he is speechless.
Yep.
He's completely smitten by her, and not just physically, spiritually, emotionally. There's a connection between them now.
But then he still is able to turn to Tyree and say, we got to talk about these weapons and stuff like that. You got to catch me up.
Much has happened since you left, James. Come, we'll speak of it.
And of things to be done.
And he does not want her to come with them.
Right. He holds her back.
Well, and this is where I go. It's that split between this is what I should do as the leader of this tribe, and this is this woman that put a spell on me, basically. That's what I think. Back on the Enterprise, Spock's vital signs are starting to fluctuate, and Mbenga leans in and says,
There will be someone with you constantly now. When the time comes, I'll be called.
And then he gives instructions to Nurse Chapel.
As soon as he shows any signs of consciousness, call me immediately.
Yes, Doctor.
If he speaks, do whatever he says.
And then Chapel says,
Do whatever he says?
Yes. Well, that's clear enough, isn't it?
I like Mbenga.
But here's the thing. This is writing when you're writing to create a moment in the future by doing something that doesn't make sense in the present.
Oh, I see.
There is no reason that he doesn't say, listen, sometimes when Vulcans come out of this, they need physical pain in order to bring themselves to be consciousness. So it's possible that he might ask you to hit him, and then you should really hit him as hard as you can.
He doesn't really
There's no reason
for that.
The reason is because you want the scene where she's surprised and doesn't hit that. That's what you're looking for.
You want Scotty to be like, what the hell are you doing?
But him not telling her this, she might not have done it, and Spock might have died. Like, you would never not tell the nurse, hey, by the way, at this moment, you should make sure to give them this shot or perform this procedure. Of course, you'd tell the nurse that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But it does create a fun moment later on.
It's a fun moment.
You say they make the fire sticks themselves. How can you be sure?
I have looked into the village. I have seen it being done.
Can you take us to their village while it's still dark?
Yes.
And then, who's there?
Nona.
Nona.
And I know you have many ways to make your friend Tyree a man of great importance.
So Nona sees herself as Tyree's equal. She really does.
Superior.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It's more than just
He's
equal.
a pawn for her to manipulate. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, you're right.
The first thing is we start to realize that she knows.
Tyree has told me much of you. Do not blame him. It was the price for saving your life.
She promised not to tell anyone, right? And Tyree reminds her of that promise.
You will not speak of this to others.
I will not if I am made to understand.
So she's going to continue to manipulate to get what she wants.
But she's never going to just be satisfied and leave it at that. She's always going to keep digging further and wanting to go further.
And she goes, you owe me.
Right.
I saved your life. And Kirk says something that I think is really key in terms of understanding the Prime Directive and why it is there. He says,
we once were as you are. Spears, arrows. There came a time when our weapons grew faster than our wisdom, and we almost destroyed ourselves. We learned from this to make a rule during all our travels. Never to cause the same to happen to other worlds. Just as a man must grow in his own way and in his own time.
Some men never grow.
So let's start there, first of all. What happened to make them decide to have the Prime Directive?
Well, that's a great question.
I think throughout human history, we don't even have to go into space. civilizations with more power have been messing around with civilizations with less power.
Right.
Whether it's colonial power, imperial power, whether it is proxy wars. And at some point we went, man, this system doesn't work very well. And particularly when you look at imperialism and colonialism, where there were a bunch of European people who said, we have all the right answers. And all these other places are savage or wrong or doing it the wrong way. And so we're going to go and we're going to make sure they act like us. And so we're going to change their religions, change their cultures, do all this stuff because we don't like the way they're doing it.
So what you're asking is like, at what point did they decide that this Prime Directive is going to stop that vicious cycle?
Right. Because to me, it's, you know what? Yeah, India wasn't doing things the way the British was doing. Does that mean it was right for the British to take over India and tell them to do it their way? And the thing too, because the thing is what we're talking about here is someone's going to grow into who they're going to grow into. And she says,
some men never grow.
Perhaps not as fast or in the way another thinks he should. But we are wise enough to know that we are wise enough not to interfere in the way of a man or another world.
What I am saying is that just because we don't like the way a culture is doing something, the Prime Directive says we have to let them go ahead and do it.
Absolutely right.
That's the point. And sometimes they're going to be doing things that we really, really don't like. And even then, because they might not grow in the way that we want them to grow, we have to let them do it. And part of it is that a society that grows in a different way might come up with different stuff that we don't come up with. They might learn different lessons. They might do different things. And if we jump in and interfere and say, hey, we got this all figured out, well, then they're not going to go in that direction. So we have to let them evolve how they're going to evolve. And I believe there had to be some disasters that they're thinking of in specific where they didn't do it that way and it went wrong.
Listen, first of all, you just got out of a situation in bread and circuses.
Yeah.
Where this is a situation where, they did not enforce imperialism on this planet.
Right.
They just got out of there.
Yep.
Okay. In the situations that we saw where they deliberately did interfere, there was always some kind of justification for it. Okay.
Well, and things like the Archons, that was a really, really broken. That wasn't growing at all. That wasn't
Well,
going
neither
anywhere.
was the situation in the Apple.
That's true. They weren't growing, but they
weren't
were
growing.
Happy.
But they were happy, but they weren't growing.
Yes.
And, arguments, again, they're made to support either way, and both of those arguments made by Spock and McCoy.
Right.
Okay, just like arguments made by Spock and McCoy in Bread and Circuses about this planet.
Well, and we're going to get arguments with Kirk and McCoy on this planet about
Absolutely we are. Absolutely we are. But somewhere along the way, I mean, who knows exactly when that happened.
Right.
Who knows what caused that to happen? But maybe this World War III that they talked about in Bread and Circuses was the straw that broke the camel's back that made them say, when they got out into space and they were starting to encounter other worlds, like guys, we got to have something in place here. We can't interfere. We can't interfere with other civilizations. We got to let them grow on their own terms. So, I mean, when did that happen? I mean, who knows?
Well, of course we don't know. But to me, what's so weird about this is what this episode is about, is when do we interfere? And if you look at like post-World War II, the big enemy and what the Klingons on some levels are representing is the Soviet Union. And while in a lot of ways people talk about this episode is a metaphor for Vietnam,
right?
I actually think it's less a metaphor for Vietnam as it is a metaphor for proxy wars all over the world. Because what we started to do was, and what the Soviet Union started to do, they want to expand, and we have to stop communism from spreading. And so we started arming a whole bunch of people, some of them not so nice, to try to make sure that communism didn't spread.
Right.
And so, whether it's, talking about the Bay of Pigs or all sorts of places, this is something that American foreign policy has been doing a ton and is still doing to this day.
I think this episode does both. I think it does. I agree. It's addressing what you're talking about by addressing specifically. I mean, it specifically addresses the brush wars on the Asian continent.
Right.
So it is making a direct reference to Vietnam. But that's the entry point to what you're talking about. Because, again, long after Vietnam, this exact situation reared its head again when it came to Afghanistan.
To me, that's what this episode is an examination of. It's actually an examination of us in the 20th century or even 21st century of how we deal with other cultures and
Absolutely.
other places. And particularly in conflicts that are very difficult to resolve, which is where we are.
You must let the villagers destroy us. You will not help your friend and brother kill them instead?
Right. Nona lays it out.
Yeah. And then Tyree angrily.
No! I said I will not kill!
You would let him die when you have weapons to make him powerful and safe? Then he has the wrong friends. And I had the wrong husband.
And she walks out. It's a pretty darn powerful exit.
You will help in ways she does not understand. I have faith in our friendship, James.
And this is the thing. There isn't a good way for him to help. Like Tyree's hope is maybe misplaced at this moment.
Well, there's no easy answers.
No, exactly. That's the big problem. That is both what makes this episode good and what makes this episode troubling, I think.
What's bothering you, Jim? If we find the Klingons have helped the villagers, there's certainly something we can do.
That's what's bothering me. There's something we may have to do.
So now, when they beam down to the planet, he was not thinking about arming the hill people or a balance of power. He was trying to just kind of set the planet back to what it was 13 years ago, this peaceful society, and they're going to grow into a peaceful, advanced culture. Like, that's what he wants this planet to resume its course on.
And now he's starting to think, oh no, I might have to do something I really don't want to do.
Something far more drastic.
And here's the question, and I don't think we can know the answer. If there was no Nona, would Kirk be having this exact same thought? Or is part of why he's having this thought because she actually does have a powerful influence on him?
Well, she definitely has a powerful influence on him. And I think that powerful influence on him is making him come to this conclusion much, much faster.
So maybe he would come to this conclusion without her.
I do think he would have come to this conclusion without her. Not saying that it's the right decision, but I think that her influence, not just with her words, but her spiritual influence on him now, is making him come to the decision he's going to come to much, much faster.
And that's part of what's weird about this episode is that if that's true, then this is a corrupted Kirk making these decisions. And that makes this more troubling than it was before.
For sure. Right. Well, actually, that's a really good point. Because if you're saying that the decision that Kirk makes to arm the hill people with flintlocks is because he's been corrupted.
Yes.
And he is not...
Well, it's possible.
He is not acting on his... completely on his own. That's troubling.
Yeah.
That this is not a purely instinctive decision independently on Kirk to come to this conclusion. That his decision to establish this balance of power, especially with the heated argument he's about to get into with McCoy, is influenced by Nona.
Yeah.
That's a level I never considered.
Well, this is what's weird about one of the many things is weird about the episode, and that does two things. One is we actually could say that makes it more motivatable that Kirk makes a decision that I'm really not comfortable with, and two, it makes it a much more upsetting episode if, in fact, that is why he made the decision. Or part of it.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, even if it pushed him that way by 10% or 15%, it's troubling.
Jim, this man believes in the same thing we believe in, that killing is stupid and useless.
That's Roddenberry right there.
But then why did he write this episode where the conclusion is to arm these people?
Remember when we were talking with David Jarrold, and David Jarrold said that in Gene Roddenberry's mind, Captain Kirk and Captain Picard are his avatars.
Right.
That's why, you do not diss the captain, you do not make fun of the captain.
Right.
You have an episode where Kirk is going to make a decision, and the way this episode is written, for Kirk to make this decision, Roddenberry must have felt that this was the decision that needed to be made.
Yes, I think so.
Yes.
I think that is exactly right. And that's why it feels well, and I wish I could have a conversation with Roddenberry and go, well, what was your point in this episode? What were you saying? Clearly, you're talking very specifically about Vietnam. What was your point? What were you saying that meant? But as we're sneaking into this village and Kirk takes a couple guys out, right in the middle of that, we do a very hard, sudden cut
to a Klingon. Klingon is Krell. His name is never mentioned in the actual episode, but it is written in the script that his name is Krell, played by Ned Romero. He was on TV shows like Shane, Death Valley Days, Kung Fu, Policewoman, and he was on Star Trek The Next Generation in the episode Journey's End, and he was on Voyager in the episode The Fight. He was also in films like Hang 'em High, I Will Fight No More Forever, and this is a movie I definitely have to check out, Fabulous Shixas in Distress.
That is a fantastic title.
And in walks Apella, who is the leader of the villagers, played by Arthur Bernard, who was on shows like Mannix and Rich Man, Poor Man.
You are late, my friend Apella.
And what Apella says, and this is just a troubling line right at the beginning.
A quarrel by my people. The division of some skins and a hill woman taken this morning. It's hard to divide one woman.
It's very clearly talking about rape. I mean, that is which rape
absolutely
has been a part of war throughout human history and among the most troubling and disgusting parts of war. And the Klingons' response is both logical in its way and very, very upsetting.
Give her to the man who killed the most of her people. The others will see the profit in bravery. I'll make a Klingon of you yet.
By the way, I think this guy playing the Klingons is really good.
Yeah, he is good.
Yeah,
and he, it's a shame we didn't see more of him. He's only in this couple short scenes.
But that line right there establishes as much about what the Klingons are as anything we heard in Errand of Mercy or something else.
For sure.
It's a very disturbing line that reveals a very specific worldview. And then we go back to Kirk and McCoy, who have snuck in and found the forge. They've found gunpowder. They've got
coal and sulfur.
Yeah.
They found a bunker full of materials to make flintlocks. And all they need now is a Klingon, and then they'll have their proof.
By the way, they're not even bothering to whisper. They're just talking in normal voices. And Kirk says, record all of this, and this will be evidence. As if there was something you could do with the evidence about the treaty and stuff, but we never deal with that.
Right,
That
right. They never go that far
Yeah.
to contact the Organians or even just
contact the Klingons.
Contact the Federation and
Yeah.
say, hey, we got a problem.
Yeah.
Klingons are violating the treaty. They need to be shut down.
And this is above my pay grade. And here's we've gathered all this evidence. Here you go.
And Kirk is not able to do that yet anyway, because they're not able to contact Starfleet because they're going to give themselves away.
And then they hear some voices and they hide.
I thought my people would grow tired of killing, but you were right. They see that it is easier than trading and it has pleasures.
Another really disturbing line.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And just as he's talking to Apella about him becoming essentially the leader of the whole planet and part of the Klingon Empire, McCoy hits his tricorder.
Yeah, by mistake. And the Klingon and Apella hear it, and so Kirk and McCoy have been outed. So they spring into action, and they knock out the Klingon and Apella, and they open the door to try to run out. And there's two villagers there with flintlocks, and that brings us to the end of a very exciting Act 3.
Act 4 right in the same spot. And by the way, I would say cliffhangers where then you resolve the cliffhanger instantly without much trouble.
Right, yeah.
Maybe it wasn't as good a cliffhanger because they just take those guys out.
And they're free.
Back in sickbay, Spock is sort of coming to.
Nurse.
Yes.
Hit me. The pain will help me to consciousness. Hit me.
Hit you? No, I can't.
Blast you. Strike me. If I don't regain consciousness soon, it may be too late. Hit me.
And I love her first little slap. Just
Harder. Again. Continue. The pain will help me to consciousness.
And then Scotty comes in. And he's like,
What are you doing, woman?
It's a funny moment. So Scotty grabs Chapel, and Chapel's like, no, I need to slap him. And then Vega comes in, and boy, does he let it rip into Spock. He just slaps it, and Spock's face is going from one side to the other, and Vega's putting all his weight and all his might into the slaps until Spock comes to. He grabs his hand and says,
That will be quite enough.
By the way, and maybe you won't have the same thought that I did. Is there a movie that you and I have discussed on the Cinephiles that this reminds you of?
Let's see here. Absolutely, Airplane.
Yes. I always think of Airplane.
Oh my god!
Where there's the line of people.
The line of people. Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is typical of this episode. I think this is a very entertaining scene that is stupid. That's what I think about it.
But it's entertaining.
But it's entertaining.
Yeah, it's entertaining. It's levity, and because obviously this is a very heavy episode, and Beka saved the day.
Yeah, and then Spock, says he's totally fine, and Nurse Chapel goes, "Here, let me help you, Mr. Spock," and he says,
"Thank you, nurse. I'm quite fully recovered."
Yes, I see you are.
It's a weird B-plot, but it's all done well, I think. The Hill people are practicing firing the flintlock that they stole. Tyree's aiming. Kirk is giving him instructions. Not only does he fire, but he actually hits his target on his first shot. And I think the actor playing Tyree does a really good job of being very conflicted about what he just
absolutely did. This is an awakening for him, and not the kind of awakening that he wants, that he envisioned for himself and for his people. Pulling the trigger, that's it. There's no going back.
Yeah.
You know?
And McCoy, obviously unhappy, wants to talk to Kirk, and so they head off to the cave, and the first thing McCoy says is,
"It's not bad enough there's already one serpent in Eden teaching one side about gunpowder. You're gonna make sure they all know about it."
Again, we're back to serpents and Eden and all that stuff.
Exactly. Each side receives the same knowledge and the same type of firearm. Have you gone out of your mind?
Which is a weird strategy.
Going into this conversation, even though it comes up in the dialogue that McCoy is calling out Kirk for making these decisions after this bizarre ritual that he had with Nona. And clearly Nona wants Kirk and McCoy to furnish the Hill people with firepower that will blow away the villagers. Right. But there is a lot going on. Like, there is so much, it's so provocative. And after all these years, after all these decades, after all the changes, I've gone through in my life as I've gotten older, after watching history run its course with Vietnam and then Afghanistan, and you hear Kirk so passionately behind his decision to establish a balance of power. On one hand, I think this is an amazing scene because I think the performances of William Shatner and DeForest Kelley are fantastic. There's so much conflict between them. If made me think that there's always been a lot of conflict between Kirk and McCoy. You saw in the Corbomite maneuver when he says, "Anytime you can bluff me, Doctor." And in the man trap, he says, "How your lost love affects your interest doesn't interest me. I lost a man, want to know what killed him." Like, they've gone at it quite a bit. But this is not like this. And it's a really provocative scene. I love watching this scene.
I agree, and I think this is one of the things that I think they do much less of in later episodes. It's not that there isn't conflict. It's certainly, like in Deep Space Nine, there's a lot of conflict. But Kirk said, "I need McCoy on this trip. I need advice I can trust." He didn't say that because he thought McCoy was going to agree with him. He said if McCoy was just going to agree with him, he didn't need him. You need someone's advice that disagrees with you.
And he's disagreeing.
And that's part of one of the strengths of the original series is that, and again, this is why I think the Apple, even though they make the decision that I disagree with, my opinion was really well articulated by Spock. So that's okay. Like, that's what makes it a complicated show rather than we're not just going, here's the right thing to do. We're going, let's argue about this.
Right.
Now McCoy's on this. Maybe she is controlling you.
Is it a coincidence? This is exactly what she wants. Is it? She wants superior weapons. It's the one thing neither side can have. Bones, the normal development of this planet was the status quo between the Hill people and the villagers. The Klingons changed that with the flintlocks.
What that implies is that there was always conflict between the Hill people and the villagers, and that it was even.
Well, the fact that you have Hill people and you have villagers, you're already establishing that there are two different societies going on.
Yes, but was there violent conflict between them?
Who knows?
No, there wasn't, because he said there wasn't. They have bows and arrows, but they've never used them for violence.
Oh, well, there you go.
Because this is part of the problem. Again, it's a problem with his solution. It's a problem with the episode. The implication is they've always been at it. And now one person has higher weapons, so we got to maintain the balance so they can be evenly at it like they were before.
But this goes back to my point, like, why are the Klingons doing this?
I agree. I agree.
Jim, that means you're condemning this whole planet to a war that may never end. It could go on for year after year, massacre after massacre. All right, Doctor!
I just think that it's a powerful scene, the way...
I agree, yeah.
You know, that they are really going at it, that McCoy is laying out for him what he is condemning this planet to do. And Kirk doesn't want to hear... He is upset by what he is hearing from McCoy. But he said, I need you there, like back in the sickbay, he said, I need someone there whose opinion I trust. And McCoy is giving Kirk his opinion, right. And Kirk is still making the decision that he feels is right.
All right, say I'm wrong, say I'm drugged, say the woman drugged me. What is your sober, sensible solution to all this?
This is what I said when we first started talking. Anyone who thinks there's a simple solution to these kinds of problems is wrong.
Right.
And I love that McCoy doesn't have one. He doesn't have a magical way to solve this problem. Although I think going to the Organians or dealing with the peace treaty might have been a better way than what they're doing. But he doesn't have one. And then this is where we get to this connection.
Bones. Do you remember the 20th century brush wars on the Asian continent?
Now, by the way, I don't think Vietnam was ever called brush war. That's not, I think that's a Star Trek phrase. It is not right. It is because I think what they're doing is like it's Vietnam-ish. You know, we want you to think of Vietnam without actually saying Vietnam.
Yes, I remember. It went on bloody year after bloody year. Well, what would you have suggested? That one side arm its friends with an overpowering weapon? Mankind would never have lived to travel space if they had. No. The only solution is what happened back then. Balance of power.
And here's the thing. That does not describe Vietnam. And it doesn't describe most of these. There's no conflict that I can think of where we said, let's limit the kinds of weapons we're giving to someone in order for everything to be equal, other than not using weapons of mass destruction. The only way we didn't escalate was we didn't give anyone nuclear bombs. But other than that, we gave the Vietnamese the latest weapons. They had the best stuff, just as we gave Afghanistan the latest weapons. It's never been to maintain a balance of power. There's nowhere, we never said, hey, we want to maintain things even in Vietnam. Right. We want to keep the communists out of Vietnam. That's always been the motivation. So this isn't exactly analogous to anything that we've been in.
I completely agree. The stakes in Vietnam and Afghanistan were much, much greater, and we weren't arming one side so they would have equal
weapons to the other side.
That was not the motive.
We wanted to win.
Right. That was not the motive.
Well, and it's, the Vietnamese was a French colony. And so the first war was a war of rebellion against the French, and then we jumped in on the French side to put down a rebellion because we believed, and again, I'm not going to argue whether or not this point is true, there was the domino theory, and that if a country became communist, well, the next door neighbor country was more likely to become communist, and then the Soviet Union would take over the world. That was the idea that we were afraid of.
But in the context of this episode, in the context of a private little war, this is the way that they are making a statement about Vietnam.
Yes.
Like this is the way they're doing it.
Yeah.
The decision in the episode that Kirk makes is he describes it as
trickiest, most difficult, dirtiest game of them all, but the only one that preserves both sides.
In the sense of this episode, whether or not this is exactly the situation in Vietnam, which it wasn't,
right,
or Afghanistan, which it wasn't, in the context of this episode, what is his alternative?
I will give you a couple of answers that I think. But because I think one of the interesting things, I actually think this is more useful in thinking about proxy wars. Because the difference in Vietnam and in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is we were there. We weren't arming people to fight other people. That was our war. We were in the middle of it.
Right.
But if you look at the Contras in Nicaragua, well, that's much closer to what's happening here. Or if you look at the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan, that's where we're arming another people to fight another people. That and this is something when I was looking it up, and is that we're still doing it. We sell arms to 96 different countries, a lot of them in the Middle East, and so we are currently selling arms to Saudi Arabia. One of the big reasons we're selling arms to Saudi Arabia is because we're afraid of Iran, and so we are still. And this is so both today, There's worry about Russia, just like there used to be worry about Soviet Union, and there's worried about Islamic extremism all over the world. So like an example of a proxy war is we support the Shah of Iran, and the Shah was either a horrible, scary dictator or a really good leader, depending on where you were in Iran. Iran was very cosmopolitan and women had much more rights at the time. He gets thrown over by Shia Islamic extremism. And we are really worried about that. So we give a lot of arms to a guy who is a Sunni, more secular guy to fight against Iran. And that guy's Saddam Hussein. And this is what we've done throughout American history is over and over, we arm people because they're going to fight against other people. And then sometimes those people, like the Taliban is another example, end up not being such people that we want to be dealing with. And so when we're talking about this delicate balance that Kirk is talking about, it is far more and this is where I go, to me, this is where the Prime Directive comes from, is over and over and over again, getting involved in stuff and having it go south. That's where, to me, the Prime Directive comes from.
Agreed. By the way, this is really bold that this actually aired in 1968.
I agree.
Especially that it aired after the Tet Offensive. And even though the word brush wars
isn't exactly the thing,
it's close enough. I mean, clearly it's about, he's making a direct reference to Vietnam without saying the words Vietnam.
And I love where McCoy, because his next argument is so powerful. He says,
here's another morsel of agony for you. Since Tyree won't fight, he will be one of the first to die.
He says, what does Kirk say? He says,
war isn't a good life, but it's life.
But what I go to when Kirk says war isn't a good life, but it's life, I go to, I'm not going to kill today.
Right.
Where is the guy who said, I'm not going to kill today?
Maybe he's under the influence of Nona.
Well, and then again, that's really troubling. And in fact, that's the next thing he says, because he goes, well,
his wife is the only way to reach him.
Back on the bridge, we just check in. The Klingons haven't spotted them yet, but we do hear they beam someone aboard, which I'm assuming is our Klingon is now beamed back up to the Klingon ship.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Kirk spots Nona getting dressed.
By the way, that was not where the scene actually began. There's a deleted scene where you actually see Nona bathing in a stream.
I've seen a picture of this scene. I've never seen the deleted scene, but it looked pretty sexy.
The actual deleted scene is on the blooper reel.
Oh.
And it was included on the blooper reel because it was taken out of context. But the thing is that Nancy Kovac insists that was not her.
Oh.
That they used a body double for the filming of that scene. Because she doesn't remember filming it.
Okay. Now, I would like to know the truth of that.
You are here because I wished you here.
Oh, I thought it was my idea.
Yes. They always believe they come of free will. Tyree even thought the same when I cast my first spell on him.
She's really holding the cards, it seems like.
Well, and so two questions. One, does she believe that?
I think she absolutely
She believes that she summoned him.
Sure.
Did she summon him?
That I don't know.
I don't know either. I mean, I think she didn't. I think Kirk is... there is absolutely no way of knowing from 0 to 100% how much control Nona has on Kirk at this moment.
Right.
My feeling is it's 20% or 30%.
I think the influence is there.
Yeah.
But I still think that Kirk is he's dominating.
Yeah, I think he's there. Yeah, I mean, well, and the thing is like, if I have to make a decision and I kind of really like a person on one side of the decision and I kind of dislike the person on the other, I can't help having that affect me making the decision.
The reason why I think that Kirk is in control is because of what he said. He's like, I'm not talking about giving them our phasers.
Right.
I just want to establish a balance.
Right.
So what Nona wants is
the
give
whole
us
thing,
your phasers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
she goes,
smell this fragrance? Some find it pleasing.
And there's that leaf that we saw before.
Mm-hmm. And then it's starting, and now, now she has power over
it. Yeah, absolutely. And we see him hit him, and you see him resist it, and he keeps trying to have his conversation, and she keeps getting it under his nose, and he keeps getting more affected by it. And who walks up while this is happening but Tyree?
And he walks up, when he walks into the frame, he has a smile on his face because he sees two people that mean everything to him, Nona and Kirk. But then that quickly changes to surprise and shock when he realizes the context in which they are together.
Yep.
And then Kirk is completely taken over.
Yes, you are lovely.
Again, this is a really well-constructed moment because Kirk, who would never betray his friend Tyree, is now betraying his friend Tyree. And Tyree, who just said, I will not kill, lifts up that flintlock and is aiming it at his brother, Kirk.
He's aiming it, and then he comes to his senses.
Yep.
And he looks at the gun, and he's like, what have I done? What was I about to do? And he just throws the gun down.
And then, and again, this is where Star Trek is really good, is right in the middle of these multiple complicated things going on.
Here comes the Mugatu. Another Mugatu. And that's what I love about this episode. Is like these things are all over the place. And
well, this one, it seems like, is the mate of the one that we already saw.
Right. That's what they established.
And Kirk is not in fighting trim at this moment.
Even when they're under attack initially, he still just wants to make out with Nona.
She has trouble getting away from him. She finally gets away from him. She's under attack by the Mugatu, manages to roll away. Kirk kind of comes to enough to see there's a problem and just jumps on the Mugatu because he's still out of it. Then he gets knocked away, finally draws his phaser and
shoots it, and it disappears.
And now she had seen the phaser warming up some rocks before.
Right.
Now she sees what it really does.
And she takes a rock while Kirk is coming to, and she bonks him over the head with it, takes his phaser.
By the way, I love the way it's shot because they cut right before she hits him on the head.
Yeah, you don't see it. You don't see her actually hit him.
Yeah, which is, I think, a good choice. And Tyree's walking back into camp, and they go, "Where's the fire stick?"
There! I left it. There.
It's a fine thing to leave lying around.
What's great about it, though, is that this is Tyree saying, I absolutely refuse to kill. That's what he's saying at this moment. And they run to Kirk.
Who hit you?
Nona.
We cut to her. She's moving through the rocks. She sees some villagers, and she steps out, says,
I bring you victory for Apella.
So remember when you asked before if we were talking about whether or not she loved Tyree, and we were talking about what her loyalty to him was, and zero.
There's zero. You're
it's
right.
just about power for her.
Right. Right. Because she's just like, okay, if Tyree is not going to embrace this this potential for power, and if this Kirk is not going to help me,
right,
then I'm going to take this little box to the other side because that's where she sees her ascension to power.
Tyree's woman.
She's a Canute, too.
And the next line, it went by me every time I watched it until I was a full adult. And then I finally actually heard the next line, which is,
We won't trust this division to Apella.
What does that mean?
Apella said we had trouble earlier dividing some skins and a hill woman, which means dividing how you rape her.
Oh.
We won't trust this division to Apella.
They're going to do what they want.
Yes, and maybe Apella told them about whoever kills the most hill people gets the woman. Well, we're not going to deal with that. We're not going to bring her to him. We're going to rape her right now.
And this scene is really disturbing.
It is. It is absolutely. It's like watching the scene in West Side Story, the near rape in West Side Story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they don't get there, but it is really scary. And throughout the whole thing, I was going like, well, you have this weapon. Why aren't you shooting them?
She doesn't know how to use it.
That's what I think too. There's even a moment where they grab her and they're kissing her, and she kind of escapes and draws her knife. And I think for so long, she still thinks this is going to work out. And this is this weird thing of like, I don't like Nona. I think she's been a villain. And
she is a villain. And she is a villain. But like you said, I mean, she's an interesting character. She's a complex character. My initial point at the top of the conversation about, I don't like the way women are represented in certain areas of Star Trek, but she's clearly a strong, driven, and ambitious woman. Mm-hmm. But like these guys don't see her that way at all.
No, she's just something to take.
Right.
Well, and this is the thing. This is why horrible things happen in war. So I don't have a problem with this. I have a problem with it, of course, but I don't have a problem with it being in this episode because this is an episode about what happens when war comes to a planet. Mm. And this is it. This is what is going to happen, and it's going to happen more after this. We're back with Kirk, and he realizes his phaser's gone and that she took it. Back to the attack. She pulls her knife out, and they disarm her easily. And then Kirk and Tyree and McCoy show up, and it's just horrible.
Yeah.
Because they say,
"Help him! It's a trap. The woman's tricked us."
And then they just stab her and throw her to the ground.
Yeah. By the way, the stabbing, it looks like it hits her like in her right arm or something.
Yeah,
it's not perfectly, but still really
it's still upsetting.
And they fire. McCoy gets hit, which they don't really say anything about. He gets kind of winged
Shot in the arm,
on
yeah.
the arm. And Kirk comes in and takes out two guys, and we have the fight. And I love, even though I go like, why isn't McCoy helping them? The shot of him walking up, watching the violence, and the expression on DeForest Kelly's face of sadness, of this is what this world is going to be.
This has come to.
Yeah, it's great.
And he kneels down to Nona and realizes that she's dead.
Yep.
This is exactly what he was trying to avoid.
Yep.
Where Kirk initially said he was trying to avoid, and now it is just escalated to this point, and there's no turning back. This is really just the beginning.
And Tyree has a rock and is completely crazed, and he's repeatedly hitting someone in the head until Kirk comes up, grabs his arm, and stops him. And the look on Tyree's face at that moment is totally insane.
Well, Kirk gets into his face.
Yeah.
While they are face to face, and he has his hands on both of Tyree's arms.
Yep.
To stop him from basically smashing the guy's face in, and he just looks at him. Yep. And Tyree is. He's crossed over.
Yep.
He's past the point of no return.
Mm-hmm.
Like this was his moment where he bit the apple.
I want more of these, Kirk. Many more. I will kill them.
And he sends his guys off to track the villagers, and I think to kill them too. And this is just what goes in my brain is violence begets violence.
Mm-hmm.
Because the hill people are now going to commit atrocities against the villagers.
Yeah, this is the beginning of their war.
Mm-hmm.
Their private little war.
Well, you got what you wanted.
Not what I wanted, Bones. What had to be.
And I go, it's not what has to
Not what has to be.
There are some other things we could do. And we call up to the Enterprise, and Spock's there.
Spock, are you alive?
An illogical question, Doctor, since obviously you are hearing my voice.
Well, I don't know why I was worried. You can't kill a computer.
I don't know. The levity just doesn't work in this
It's not, yeah. I mean, Spock's one is okay to me, but that line, I mean, you literally was just in this moment.
Yeah, we were just in
seconds
this
ago.
moment. It's just intrusive.
And Kirk says,
So Spock, ask Scotty how long it would take him to reproduce 100 flintlocks.
I didn't get that exactly, Captain. 100, what?
100
Pauses.
serpents. Serpents for the Garden of Eden. We're very tired, Mr. Spock. Beam us up home.
It's the only downbeat ending of the second season. I mean, the first season had a couple, downbeat endings. Look at the ending of Charlie X. That was pretty downbeat. I mean, even Sitting on the Edge of Forever, even though they restored the future, the fact that Edith Keeler had to die, that was kind of a downbeat ending. But this is the only downbeat ending of season 2. Like I mentioned, during the last Beam Us Up Home scene, new music was composed by Gerald Fried. It was never used for any other Star Trek episode. And Gene Kuhn, in his rewrite before Gene Roddenberry rewrote him, Gene Kuhn wanted the ending to be more upbeat. I don't know how you would do that, but he was obviously overwritten by Roddenberry. And this is, speaking of Gene Kuhn, A Private Little War is the very last Star Trek episode to list Gene Kuhn as producer.
So long before you and I did this show, we talked about A Private Little War, and I said something about the end, and I always had a perception of what the end was, and you said the opposite. And I literally did something I've never done before.
What's that?
Which is that before we recorded this episode, I went and looked at things other people said about this episode. And the reason is because my perception has always been that either he didn't give them the flintlocks or it was left ambiguous. And it seems like there are a few people that thought that, but the vast majority of people think that he did. And the reason I think it the other way, or that it's ambiguous, is he never answers Scotty's question. He starts to say, Scotty says, I don't know what you're talking about. And he starts to say this, and then he says serpents into paradise and says, let's just go home. So to me, it's always been him deciding not to do it. But I don't know the answer. And maybe I'm very curious if anyone else in the world had my perception.
So the question is, so initially Scotty was told to supply 100 flintlocks.
But he didn't quite hear him.
And so Scotty was like, wait, what? And Kirk says 100 serpents for the Garden of Eden. So the question is, did Kirk, in saying serpents, did that final comment instructs Scotty to construct 100 flintlocks.
Did they go forward with the plan to arm the hill people?
My perception has always been that Kirk changed the word flintlocks to serpents just because symbolically he sees the flintlocks as serpents taking this peaceful planet out of its Garden of Eden.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that's what he's saying.
But at the same time, he was definitely ordering Scotty to construct 100 flintlocks, i.e. serpents, for this planet. There was never a question in my mind that Kirk was telling Scotty to make the guns.
It's so weird to me because, and I think from the little I looked on the internet, it seems like most people all think that. And so it's so weird to me that I was so certain. And I literally rewound and watched those lines like 5 times just to go. And I still go, it's ambiguous at best to me. But I'm really curious what other people say. You asked earlier, what would I do? Well, we just saw a bit of what I would do in Trouble with Tribbles. There is clearly when the Klingons get caught poisoning the grain and having a spy, that is a diplomatic incident that they're really embarrassed about that gives the Federation a huge advantage. This is another one. To me, the solution, of course, is diplomacy, not just because again, I go with McCoy. It's like, well, what are you going to do? So then you're going to give them rifles, and then you're going to give them this. This is endless war, and again, this is Afghanistan war starts in the late 70s, and it's 2022 now, and things are not resolved in Afghanistan. That's 40 plus years of war. Like, these are not good solutions to me.
There's never a good idea to arm the other side, to arm people like this. It never works out.
Very rarely has it worked out.
I mean, it certainly has not worked out more than it has.
Well, I will say this, though, which is that because we can't go back in time and do stuff the other way, the Soviet Union might not fall if we didn't arm the Mujahideen in the war against Afghanistan. And so, but then we also sent Osama bin Laden there, and probably isn't September 11th if there was not a war against
Well, there you
Afghanistan.
Go. That's a great point.
This is why you can't just tear this apart and go, that's the answer.
There is no. You could argue. Listen, you could say, well, maybe Kirk didn't have to supply the whole people with flintlocks so fast. He could have gotten off the planet, reported the situation to Starfleet. Starfleet would have been to the Klingons. Well, guys, you broke the Organic Peace Treaty, slapped their hands, and it would have been a much bigger issue between the Federation and the Klingons.
Yep.
But no, what Kirk did was he acted on his own. Mm-hmm. And in earlier versions of the screenplay, Kirk was acting under orders from Starfleet to arm the villagers. He was under orders to do that. This episode is made more dramatic because he is basically cut off from Starfleet because he can't contact them because he'd give away the Enterprise. But he is making a decision on his own. And it's a decision that when you see how history has played out these last 50 years, knowing how history has played out, you just cringe. It's heartbreaking that he makes this decision. It's at the same time, it's easy for me to see, oh, well, they could have gotten off the planet, gone to Starfleet, and let them dealt with it. But there is no easy solution. I don't have the answer. Was Kirk's answer the wrong one? Yeah, but what choice did he have? I don't know. And that's why these things just seem to be unavoidable.
What did anybody else have any opinions on the Private Little War?
Yeah, absolutely. Walter Koenig had a pretty good opinion. He said there was one episode that confounded me because it seemed to be taking the position that was contrary to the general position of the show. And that had to do with the balance of power. The thinking behind it and the way I read it was almost fascist. That was a dangerous premise to beam across the country under the guise of entertainment. I was surprised.
Wow.
That's Walter Koenig. Mark Daniels, who directed the episode, said, I like the science fiction aspects of Star Trek, but I also like the fact that in the first 2 seasons, there was some genuine dramatic appeal and social feeling. And they weren't gimmicky in terms of being space operas. A Private Little War is a great example. And then Dorothy Fontana said, on this planet, there was a restricted war with low-cal weapons escalated by the Klingons. Well, God save our guys, so right away you increase the state of art on your side. But then they go up a notch, and then you go up a notch. And after a little while, you have to take responsibility for this. And that's what A Private Little War was all about. The show wasn't great, but I thought the message was very good.
All right, that just gave me a bunch of thoughts. So I'll kind of give you my thoughts, and part of it is going to be me rewriting this show a little bit.
Okay.
So what I think, so Dorothy Fontana said that there was this conflict between these two sides and that they were escalating, right? And I think the problem, one of the problems with the script is that Kirk says, "Hey, this was all peaceful."
Right.
If it actually, there had always been violence between the hill people and the village people, that actually would have made this work better.
Right. Because when they beamed down, Kirk said, no, they were completely peaceful. Everything was all peace, love, and understanding, and everything was great. And then there was no division. There was no conflict. It was never established that there was a conflict between the hill people and the villagers.
Yeah, and if they'd done that, then this stuff would have made more sense.
I agree.
And you still could have had Tyree as like the Gandhi figure who was trying to resolve the conflict, so he could still be a peaceful person. But there's actually a conflict already going on. That's one thing. Second thing is that because they don't deal with how much power Nona has over Kirk, it makes the ending more troubling, whichever way it goes. It makes the ending more troubling. So it was either sort of deal with that more or deal with that less. The third thing I would say is that we want our guys to do cool stuff. And Kirk doesn't come up with a cool plan. And so what I think, if they had turned this into an episode of, this is how I would rewrite it. Let's embarrass the Klingon. Let's make the Klingon, let's get the villagers to reject the Klingon. And Kirk comes up with a plan to do that. And Tyree, as the Gandhi figure, helps them to throw away the flintlocks. That would be to me a more Star Trek-y episode.
Yeah. No, absolutely it would have been.
I mean, this one, it is what it is, and it's not an episode that I seek out because it makes me uncomfortable. It certainly engages in some serious ideas. It certainly has some really good moments and good performances, particularly DeForest Kelley, I would say, is fantastic. And it is the most troubling of all the episodes of the original series.
I completely agree with that. And I think the fact that it is so troubling is, I think, why it is an essential episode. Because it does stir conversation. Because there is no easy solution. It is such a gray zone, and that's why we keep getting ourselves, we meaning everybody, we keep getting ourselves into the same trouble over and over and over again. And maybe that's the point of the episode, is that there's no easy outcome to this. There's no easy outcome to this. I mean, the outcome you just gave would have been great. And in the context of a 50-minute Star Trek episode, it would have been great, and I would have bought it. I would have thought, oh, well,
it's fun and
great.
satisfying.
Right. Satisfying. You have a happy ending.
But we wouldn't have had this conversation.
We definitely would not have had this conversation. But I think the fact that a 55-year-old television series has one episode, among others, that can start this kind of a conversation is the reason why the original series has endured and remains the most significant and groundbreaking, trailblazing, and provocative and forward-thinking in terms of the ideas and conversations that it stirs series of them all.
I just want to say one more thing. We talked about where could the Prime Directive have come from. And what I would love people to think about is not how Star Trek applies the Prime Directive, but how should we apply it? There are some times where interfering in another culture, another country is absolutely necessary and the right thing to do. And there's some times where it leads to decades and decades of pain. And so what I would say that maybe we can get from this episode is to take those questions very, very seriously. And that even means allowing countries sometimes to do stuff that we don't particularly like, because that might end up being the better solution.
And I don't have the answers. I mean, I certainly can talk about what an episode like this proposes, the solutions that it does propose, but I certainly don't have the answers. I always thought, certainly when I was growing up, that Kirk always made the right decision, and this is one episode where I'm not sure that he does. But then again, I don't know what the alternative is.
No.
I mean, the fact that you see the ending with the serpents as being ambiguous, and I see it as pretty direct that these serpents are flintlocks. The fact that you see it as one way and I see it another way is another reason that makes this episode and the show itself so great.
Well, Obviously, this brought up a whole bunch of questions, and we would really love to hear what you think about A Private Little War. In particular, what did you think about the final moment? What does it mean? You can always visit us on social media. Do a search for us on Facebook. We're Enter Incidents on Twitter, Enterprise Incidents on Instagram.
And please make sure that you follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, and certainly YouTube. You can listen to the audio, but make sure that when you go to Apple Podcasts, please leave us a review. These reviews on Apple Podcasts are really helpful. They really help us get the word out there. And make sure that you share Enterprise Incidents on your social media platforms so that other sci-fi fans, Star Trek fans you can help them discover Enterprise Incidents. Really help us get the word about Enterprise Incidents out there.
And if you want to reach me, you can do it at SR Morris on Twitter, SR Morris1 on Instagram. And if you're interested in movies that deal with very complicated issues of war, well, on my podcast, The Cinephiles, you might want to check out our episodes on Inglourious Bastards, a very difficult movie about war. Ken Burns' The Civil War. We went through that. That looks at many, many sides of very complicated issues. Patton, Apocalypse Now, and of course, Star Trek's version of this, Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country,
yes,
with my good friend Scott Mance.
That was a fun one. Yes, and make sure you follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Movie Mance. And on the next episode of Enterprise Incidents, we are going to once again be joined by our honorary host, director Ralph Sinensky, for the 4th episode of Star Trek. He directed that episode is Obsession. Very excited to welcome our good friend Ralph Sinensky back to Enterprise Incidents for our deep dive of Obsession. And until then, keep going boldly.